Welcome back to the 99, where we are focused on brewing a better competitive commander. I'm your host, Patrick Marlad, and today we're taking a look at Syr Konrad the Grim. What makes him so grim? We'll find out. Actually, I can tell you why he's so grim. He's 5 CMC and mono black, and mono black is one of the toughest colors to play in the mono-colored genre. Why is that? There are a lot of strategies that utilize artifacts and enchantments that just shut black decks down because we don't have a good way to answer those cards. However, this is far and away my favorite mono black list to date because it skirts around the grave hate pieces that threaten to take black decks out of the game. This particular Syr Konrad the Grim, Justin and I pulled during our recent SCG Philly trip where we played Throne of Eldraine Two-Headed Giant. And if you want to see how that went, you can watch our previous vlog on the matter. Now, you might have noticed that during our Throne of Eldraine set review, neither Ernesto and I mentioned this particular card of the mono black legendaries to release because I didn't really foresee it having a future. However, after looking up different play lines and studying how we could abuse this guy, I found out that it was actually the best mono black legendary to release from the set because of its unique triggered ability. As a matter of fact, its activated ability also helps us a whole lot too. Now, what are those effects? He's on the screen now, but if you want to check out the entire deck list that I'm going to be talking through today, as a matter of fact, I'll be going through it as I guide you through the list. You can do so by following the link down in the description, but let's start by reading off what Syr Konrad does. So, as I mentioned, he's 5 CMC, 3 generic, 2 swamps, 2 blacks, legendary creature, knight, human, maybe relevant for some of you, I don't know. Whenever another creature dies, or a creature card is put into a graveyard from anywhere other than the battlefield, or a creature card leaves your graveyard, Syr Konrad the Grim deals 1 damage to each opponent. So, almost aristocratic-like, except there's no life gain involved in this. It's just doing damage to opponents. Not life loss, but damage. So if they have something that says prevents damage, Glacial Chasm, I guess, this is not going to work. So maybe we should put a strip mine in our list. However, it does have one more ability. It's 1 generic, 1 black, activated. You don't need to tap them, nothing else. Each player puts the top card of their library into their graveyard. So when you look at Syr Konrad, I think the thing that folks immediately saw as abusable was that first triggered effect. It's not too unlike a lot of aristocrat builds. And in mono black, we have a lot of ways to make creatures die. Other creatures die. So we can use a typical loop with Gravecrawler. If you have Gravecrawler, Phyrexian Altar, and a zombie on the battlefield, you can just keep casting and recasting him, sacrificing him to the Phyrexian Altar. Phyrexian Altar sacrifices a creature, makes a mana of any color. You'll choose black. Go ahead, cast Gravecrawler, and if Syr Konrad's on the battlefield, you'll damage out the board that way. That's fine. However, things like Grafdigger's Cage will shut that down. We don't want to have to deal with Grafdigger's Cage because we don't have very many great ways to deal with that. Ratchet Bomb, Powder Keg, we have Blast Zone now. There are a few options, but we don't want to get waylaid by a 1 CMC artifact. And there's things like Nim Deathmantle that bring creatures back from the graveyard if you pay 4 generic. So the only thing that really functions well with that are cards like Ashnod's Altar, things that generate tokens, the Weapon Master, or the Marionette Master, I forget what their names are. The big one is Priest of Gix. Priest of Gix, ETBs, generates 3 black. You sacrifice him with Phyrexian Altar or Ashnod's Altar, you can bring him back with Nim Deathmantle. Again, a fine strategy. We're killing a creature, we're doing damage to the board, however, it utilizes our graveyard, and I wanted to avoid that with my Syr Konrad build. Now, the thing that holds Mono Black list back is the fact that they use their graveyard almost exclusively for a lot of their core strategies. I mean, we're talking about the color that has all of the anime dead auras, Entomb, Buried Alive. Of course, that's the goal of Black. However, in a commander setting, it's not very effective. Particularly if black is the only color you're using, as there's little to no removal for artifacts or enchantment grave hate pieces. There's just not a black card that says remove target artifact and or enchantment. We do have one card, Mire in Misery, that just came out in the 2019 commander set that says your opponent can sacrifice a creature and or enchantment. We might be able to use that to great effect in this particular list, but that's only because of how we are trying to employ new strategies. We're trying to stall the board out, make infinite mana that doesn't utilize the grave, and then of course cast our Syr Konrad and utilize his activated effect to damage out the board. So while we get into this video, I want to start with the stall effects, the things that are going to help us hate the board, slow everything down, and allow us to set up our infinite mana strategy. Because the infinite mana loops in this particular list, the combos that we're using, they require us to get to at least turn 6. And while there are combos in this list that allow us to win before turn 6, this is a mid-range list, mid to long game list that will utilize Cabal Coffers and or Magus of the Coffers to net our infinite mana. So as you can tell, we will need a lot of swamps on the field, and to do so is going to be very intensive because we have 99 cards and we're trying to get 6 swamps on the field. So we're going to talk about how to make that a little bit easier, but let's start with our stall board pieces. And I've separated them individually for you over on the primer, but there's different stacks elements. There are discard utilities, there are board wipes, and there is targeted removal, targeted and or mass sacrifice removal. So in the stacks piece build, we've got Mono Web. If you've never seen this card, it's something I highly encourage you use. It's really good against multicolored lists. It's really good against monocolored lists, particularly because it's one-sided. So it's 3 CMC. It's whenever any land target opponent controls is tapped for mana, tap all lands he or she controls that produce any type of mana that land can produce. So even if it's a dual land that's an island forest and he taps an island, he or she taps an island, he has to tap that island forest. And of course you can tap it in response and net mana for that turn, but if you're trying to do something on someone else's upkeep, you're committing to tapping said lands. And if we have Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth, then everything's a swamp. So Mono Web effectively shuts down all their lands every turn. This card always works like a charm. It's a non-threat to a lot of folks when they see it, but when they realize they're not getting to play on other people's turns because they have to tap their lands out, it puts them in a very bad place. It's actually a perfect setup for this next card. We don't really care about dumping cards into our graveyard. I mean, that's what black does, right? So we have Mesmeric Orb. This is too generic for an artifact, and there's a 2-card combo that works really swell with this piece, and it's actually one of our win cons. We'll talk about it later. But Mesmeric Orb is whenever a permanent becomes untapped, that permanent's controller puts the top card of his or her library into his graveyard, his or her graveyard. So the thing with this is someone top deck tutors, you play Mesmeric Orb, whatever they tutored goes away. And during the mid-length of the game, folks are just going to be milling stuff that they likely need. And again, because we're playing the blacklist, we usually don't care that stuff is in our graveyard. Generally, it's not an issue. So Mesmeric Orb is actually a really good setup piece for us and plays well into our strategy, as well as makes other lists defective. Now, this is the most counter to a mono black list ever because we're using a grave you hate card ourselves. So we have Silent Gravestone. I'm going to go over the stacks pieces in particular and the discard utilities, but the board wipes and the removal pieces should be fairly obvious. But why we use Silent Gravestone? It doesn't allow us to use reanimate effects that target either enchantment-based and or sorcery-based or instant-based. However, Silent Gravestone is going to shut down things that allow our opponents to manipulate their graveyard. And because there are actual reanimate effects that don't target in the graveyard, we can get around Silent Gravestone's effect, and I'll talk about those afterwards. But Silent Gravestone is one generic for an artifact. Cards in graveyards can't be the targets of spells or abilities. Well, that shuts down a lot of things, and it's very fantastic in this list because, again, we don't care about that. We have things like Shallow Grave and Corpse Dance, that pull creatures from our graveyard and there's a limited number of creatures in this list if you're looking at it. The creature we're trying to pull back is Magus of the Coffers, pretty much always. But it'll pull the top creature from our graveyard back onto the battlefield. So if you like to rearrange your graveyard as you play so people can see relevant pieces and or you can see relevant pieces, you can't do that with this particular list. You're going to need to keep it stacked as it is because Shallow Grave and or Corpse Dance should be bringing back your Magus of the Coffers and giving it haste, by the way. So that skirts around Silent Gravestone's static effect. And then, of course, it has an activated ability for generic, tap it, exile Silent Gravestone, and all cards from all graveyards draw a card. You're not going to use that one all too often. You will if there's a graveyard strategy that your opponents are deploying, such as a Gitrog list or a Kess list, if they've got some sort of value there, whatever the list is that's using a reanimate strategy, Silent Gravestone is there to shut them down. We've got a whole lot of orbs in this list, and the next one is the Torpor Orb. This is the bane of my existence, except for in this list. It's too generic for an artifact. Creatures entering the battlefield don't cause abilities to trigger. Well, I mean, I can think of a lot of artifacts, spell tutors, things that enter the battlefield and find things. Even the likes of Imperial Recruiter or Recruiter of the Guard can't be used. This is a really effective means of stunting other decks' strategies. And I mean, if you want to stop Godo, this is a good way to do it. Torpor Orb is a must if you don't care about creatures entering the battlefield to do things. This is just a good way to shut them down. I highly suggest you use Torpor Orb in lists that can use Torpor Orb. And the next orb on our list is the Winter Orb. It's too generic and it has a symmetrical effect. You likely know this. If you've played against an Urza list, you've likely seen Winter Orb. It actually works very well here because we only need that Cabal coffers. But Winter Orb, as long as Winter Orb is untapped, don't know why that clause is in there. Players can't untap more than one land during their untap step. So we're trying to stall the board, right? The best way to handle that is to stop people from untapping all their lands. And, we don't have any great artifact destruction, so we're not going to be able to, dismantle their artifact mana base. However, if we can dismantle their land base, this is a good way to do so. And of course, we're going to be leveraging our artifacts as well. So, we should be even on the playing field and hopefully a step up from our opponents if we got into a lot of our fast mana early game, mid game. But I like Winter Orb in this list a lot. It's a stacks element that can switch out for a various other piece, but I think it works well here, and that's why it's in the list. And lastly, we have our very own Rest in Peace in black, although it does cost a lot more unless it's in your opening hand. But we have Leyline of the Void. It's too generic, too black for an enchantment, and if Leyline in the Void is in your opening hand, you can just reveal it and begin the game with it. So this is before any play starts. Obviously, before you draw, you're going to show everyone that, hey, this is in my hand, blamp, I just get to have it on the field. And from here on out, if a card would be put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead. Well, what are we using that messes with the top of their deck? Not only Sir Conrad, but our Mesmeric Orb? Oh, this feels so good. Leyline of the Void is fantastic, particularly because it's one-sided. So even if we were using our own graveyard, this wouldn't hamper our own strategy. I know a lot of you guys will still want to use graveyard loops and combos to net infinite death triggers and or infinite mana that way. Leyline of the Void is a good way to do that without hurting yourself. Of course, you can use cards like Planar Void as well. It's a triggered effect that does much the same thing. It will exile cards that go into graveyards. However, that does hit you as well. So Leyline of the Void is my preferred exile all the things card, particularly because we are making everyone discard and we're rolling the tops of libraries. So we're going to use Leyline. So how else do you stall the board in a mono black list outside of our stacks elements and of course targeted and mass board wipe removal? There's not a list I can think of that operates without a creature as some part of a play line that works into a loop or combo that effectively gains them the win. So obviously things like Go for the Throat and Snuff Out are going to be very useful for stopping other people's strategies. So don't really need to talk about those. Things like Damnation, yes, wiping the board is always very effective. There is one thing that mono black players never really use, and it's kind of upsetting because it's a strategy that, just mono black gets in general that is underappreciated, and that is discard utilities. So that's the next one I want to talk through. Obviously, the big ones are Thoughtseize, Duress, cards like that are very effective for helping folks go off on their combo turn. If they understand X, Y, or Z has some form of countermeasure for them, you'll pry into their hand, know what the rest of their hand was, and get rid of the threat. So they have those obvious utilities, but mass discard is also very valuable. And a card that I really love for mono blacklist is Liliana the Veil. So if you don't know what she does, she's amazing. She's used in a lot of formats, but she's also used in Commander sometimes, at least when I'm brewing. She's 1 generic and 2 black for a Planeswalker that is 3 loyalty counters when it enters, and it has a +1 that says each player discards a card. Well, that's useful. We're going to use this when we have our Mags of the Coffers in our hand, and we'll just throw it into our graveyard. Because as we know, Shallow Grave, when we resurrect that, it'll come into the field with haste. We can do the thing whenever we choose. But what's nice about it is that we can ditch our value and hopefully strip someone else of their own value. Now, obviously, if someone else is using a graveyard strategy, you can be effectively helping them. But if we have Leyline of the Void out, not so much. Not that many lists want their cards in exile outside of Food Chain. So Liliana of the Veil, obviously very effective for that, but she also has a -2 to make target player sacrifice a creature. So if your opponent just keeps trying to recast their commander, you can just keep on making them sacrifice it for as long as you have loyalty counters on her. But with what we're doing to the board state, stripping all the creatures, destroying all the creatures, our Planeswalkers should hopefully hit, because we have the other Liliana in here as well. Liliana of the Dark Realms. You've likely never seen her in a commander list, but it's important we hit those swamps. So important we use Liliana of the Dark Realms. But outside of their Planeswalkers, we also have Arterial Flow. It's a little better with vampires, but it's very good by itself. So it's 1 generic, 2 black, same cost as Liliana. For a sorcery, each opponent discards 2 cards. I wish they were random cards. It's no Hymn to Turok, but it's very good. If you control a vampire, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. So you would only ever net 2 life and they would all lose 2 life. It doesn't matter. We don't have vampires in here. What we want is a cheap mass discard, and making everyone discard 2 cards is fantastic. Whatever your opponent had by way of protection and by way of combo piece in their hand, they're going to have to decide over one over the other if their hand is consistent of 4 cards. So if you keep plugging away at them, making them discard their utilities, they're going to have a less efficient game. So we want to be able to do this, particularly with cards that are single-sided. I love Arterial Flow, and I really love more effects like Duress. And we're using Blackmail in the list. Blackmail is single target. It's very good mid-game, though. And again, we're trying to work up to turn 6, turn 7. We're trying to play a longer game with this list. Blackmail is 1 black for a sorcery. Target player reveals 3 cards from his or her hand, and you choose one of them. That player discards that card. There's no stipulation as to what type of card it can be that you make them discard. It's not, lands and or enchantments or whatever the instance might be. This is letting you discard anything. Again, if we've been plugging away at them this whole time and everyone's down or deficient in hand size to 3 and or 4 cards, we're likely hitting all of their hands, or at least most of their hand, to where we can get rid of something that they certainly didn't want us to remove. Blackmail's good, a little underrated, especially if you intend to play a longer game, if at least that's what your list is doing. It's very good. And Duress, we don't really need to go over it. You likely know what it is, but it's 1 black for a sorcery. Target opponent reveals their hand. You choose a non-creature, non-land card from it. That player discards that card. So sorcery, instant, enchantments, you name it, you can make them drop it. It's very, very effective. Almost the same thing with Inquisition of Kozilek. It's 1 black for a sorcery. Target player reveals his or her hand. You choose a non-land card from it with a converted mana cost of 3 or less. That player discards that card. So this is a minor stipulation that has to be 3 and under. Most CEDH lists are rolling with a low curve. You will find targets for this. You will be able to use this. And you're noticing a theme here with a single target removal. Mire's Toll being the next one. So Mire's Toll, 1 black, sorcery speed. Again, very consistent with a mana cost for these cards. Target player reveals a number of cards from his or her hand equal to the number of swamps you control. We have 15, and we're using Urborg, so we should have a lot. You choose one of those cards, and that player discards that card. Fantastic removal. Another one I don't see often enough, very easy to do here because we're not delving elsewise, is Tasker's Cruelty. It's 5 generic, 1 black. Seems like a bad thing. Hold on. Each opponent discards 2 cards. Solid. It's Arterial Flow, but a little bit more expensive. But wait, it has Delve. So everything that we're milling from ourselves, we are able to use to make this go off. So it should hopefully get us in a good place to go ahead and combo off without any threat of opposition. Lastly, we have Thoughtseize and Vicious Rumors. There's a lot of discard utilities in this list, but Thoughtseize is another 1 CMC sorcery one that strips a single card from a single opponent's hand. Again, you just need to know your meta or understand where your opponent's board state is at and where they might be at with their hand to effectively net their own win. so you can stifle that and or stop an opponent from stopping you. But Thoughtseize, you choose a non-land card from their hand, that player discards that card, you lose 2 life. Really good. You want Thoughtseize. And Vicious Rumors, I guess it's a pet card of mine, but I find it very effective. It's 1 black, sorcery, speed. Vicious Rumors deals 1 damage to each opponent. That's cool. Maybe they ad nauseum to 1 life and didn't win. Well, you can kill them with this card. Each opponent discards a card and then puts the top card of their library into their graveyard. I like both of those things. I like doing it on a massive scale. I just made my opponents remove 2 cards from not only their list, their deck rather, but their hand. That's amazing. So that's 6 cards in total that they don't get to see. And on top of all that, you gain 1 life. What's not to like? In a multiplayer game, this is, just grossly effective. And if you're using things like Waste Not, I don't have that on the list right now, Vicious Rumors is even better. So we have nearly 30 ways to disrupt the board by way of stacks, pieces, discard utilities, board wipes, and single target removal. That is a lot. That is near about 1/3 of our list, just dedicated to stunting our opponents and stalling the board. And that's not to include cards like Shred Memory and or Praetor's Grasp, where we can just take a win con from our opponent. There are plenty of ways baked into this list that help us stall the board. So with that out of the way, let's talk about how we win. Now, you've likely seen some of these strategies employed before, but they're very effective here because, again, we don't have to use our graveyard to do any of them, unless we're setting up the Magus of the Coffers, Corpse Dance / Shallow Grave setup. Okay, so if our Magus dies, we will have to bring him back. Normally, play him out early, use him as ramp. If he dies, it's fine. We'll employ one of our other strategies. But there are 3 ways to net infinite black mana. Now, why do we want infinite black mana? Sir Conrad's effect, unlike Thrasios, unlike Urza, isn't just generic, because they couldn't give mono black a leg up because it's the worst mono color in the game. They had to make it a generic and a black to use his ability. They could have made it too generic and he would have still been fine. However, if we make infinite black mana, we can cast Syr Konrad as many times as we need. If he's countered, doesn't matter. We'll keep casting Konrad until he sticks, and then we'll use his ability, again, because it's generic and a black, to just make everyone mill the top card of their library into their graveyard. Why is this relevant? Well, if we read his triggered ability again, if a creature were to enter the graveyard from anywhere other than the battlefield, it deals 1 damage. If a creature were to leave the graveyard, it deals 1 damage. Well, what do we know that helps us shuffle cards from our graveyard back into our library? We have all of the Titans to choose from. The Eldrazi Titans. The cards that read, when this card is put into your graveyard from anywhere, its owner shuffles it into his or her library. Specifically, I use Kozilek for this list, and if you're worried about someone removing Kozilek from your graveyard, because that would stunt you, you can add another Titan. You can add another Eldrazi. Is it essential? I haven't found that to be the case. Again, with all of the single targeted removal, we're able to see our opponent's hands at any given state. And again, I would hold those things off, the duress cards off, until we're ready to go. In the list that very obviously has Grave Hate, in some fashion, we're going to look at their hand first, because we're going to want to strip them of that. Okay, their Rakdos Charm, whatever it is, we're going to want to take that from them so they don't get rid of our Eldrazi. But essentially, when the Eldrazi Shuffler goes into our graveyard from anywhere and Conrad's out, 1 damage. Oh, and Kozilek, he went into the graveyard, so let's shuffle that graveyard back into our list. 1 damage. If your opponents don't lose because Conrad is making them mill themselves to where they don't have a library anymore, and if Leyline of the Void is out rather, and their deck is just completely exiled, there are other shuffle lists out there. Well, you can just keep doing this until you've effectively damaged them out. So you need a Titan in your list. Why we don't use ad nauseum. You don't want to ad nause into a 10-drop. Okay, and it's not really essential. We do use all of the draw effects we can to go through our list, and we use Necropotence to draw through our list. We just need the effect. The triggered ability of exiling the thing when it goes in your graveyard, kind of irrelevant because we just play past that. But infinite black mana can be achieved in one of these 3 ways. I like this one the best because it has the least amount of breaking points, at least in all of the groups I've played in. Not that many people run land hate, but if they do, you're going to be in a bad spot. But it's Rings of Brighthearth, Deserted Temple, and Cabal Coffers with at least 6 swamps on the battlefield. So how does this first infinite black combo work? Well, to start, you need Rings of Brighthearth on the battlefield, obviously, as well as the Deserted Temple and Cabal Coffers. Make sure you don't play your land per turn if you're waiting for that last piece. If you have a tutor, get that last piece and go for it. The thing that's going to be your best friend here is Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth. You need 6 swamps. Obviously, if not all the other lands or swamps in your graveyard, this is going to stunt you. And remember, Cabal Coffers isn't a swamp either, so you need to have Urborg out on turn 6 to have that threshold. But when you do have it, you'll be able to tap Cabal Coffers for 6 black mana. Then you'll use Deserted Temple to untap target land. And while that ability is on the stack, you can use the triggered effect of Rings of Brighthearth to pay 2 generic, and if you do, copy that ability and choose a new target for the copy. So with a new target, you'll go ahead and untap Deserted Temple. Now, if you're doing the math, it's 2 to tap the Cabal Coffers. It is 1 to tap the Deserted Temple, and it's 2 more to use the triggered effect on Rings of Brighthearth. So that leaves us with 5 generic mana to spend on all of this. But if we're tapping for 6, we're always going to come out with 1 on top. So we can keep doing this to net infinite mana. Now, very similarly to the strategy, we're going to use Magus of the Coffers alongside Umbral Mantle to generate infinite black mana. And again, the threshold is exactly the same. We need at least 6 swamps. Umbral Mantle is a very popular combo piece in any Selvala list, but here we utilize it with Magus of the Coffers. It is 3 generic for an artifact equipment. It's 0 to equipped, so the setup cost is pretty affordable. However, to activate it, its effect rather, you need to pay 3 and untap a creature. That creature gets +2/+2. Now, we don't necessarily care about the +2/+2. We're really concerned about that untap because Magus of the Coffers at 4 generic and 1 black, Human Wizard at 4/4, has an ability that says 2, tap, add 1 black mana to your pool for each swamp you control. So it's the mirror image of our Cabal Coffers. Now, to do this, we just need to tap Magus of the Coffers. Again, we need a threshold of at least 6 swamps. Then we'll go ahead and use the untap activated ability of our equipped Umbral Mantle to go ahead and untap him, give him +2/+2, and continue the chain. It's all pretty simple. We just need a certain threshold of swamps on the battlefield. Again, it could be our own Urborg, an opponent's Urborg that's assisting us, but we need at least 6 swamps. Why is that? Magus of the Coffers is going to tap 2 to generate 6 mana, and then of course it's going to cost 3 for the Umbral Mantle to untap Magus of the Coffers, another 2. Again, it leaves us net positive with 1 black mana, and once we go through that loop, again, we're going to be up 1 every single time. But our last infinite combo utilizes Rings of Brighthearth again, Basalt Monolith, and a card you might not have heard of called Initiates of the Ebon Hand. And I'll start off by reading what he does. It's a little bit of an oddball filter, but it's a 1 black, 1/1 cleric creature, summon clerics, and it has an effect that says 1 generic to activate, add 1 black mana to your mana pool. If you spend 4 or more this way during one of your turns, bury Initiate of the Ebon Hand. At the end of said turn, you play this ability as a mana source, so it is a mana ability. It doesn't utilize the stack, is basically what this is saying. So, with Rings of Brighthearth and Basalt Monolith, we're going to net infinite generic mana. How do we do that? If you don't know what Basalt Monolith is, it's a 3 generic artifact. It doesn't untap during your untap step. However, it has an ability, an activated ability that reads 3 generic, untap Basalt Monolith. Well, the card itself taps for 3 generic. So we can go ahead and do that ability to tap and untap itself and, a measurable amount of times, as many times as we want to do that. It's fun, especially with another card in our list. However, alongside Rings of Brighthearth, if we activate a Basalt Monolith mana ability and net 3 generic and put the untap Basalt Monolith activated ability on the stack, we can use Rings of Brighthearth to spend 2 generic instead of 3 to get the untap trigger back on Basalt Monolith. So if you go ahead and use Rings of Brighthearth, spend 2 to put another untap activated ability on the stack, you'll untap Basalt Monolith for 2, You'll then be in turn allowed to tap it for 3, netting 3 mana, and you still have the untap activation of the original Basalt Monolith untap activation. And that's going to allow you to get infinite generic mana. I don't think I illustrated that well, but it's an age-old combo. It's something people do. Basically, no matter how you tap it, you will net infinite generic mana. It's just important to note that you need 2 of any color outside of Basalt Monolith to get the combo started. That is to activate the triggered effect of Rings of Brighthearth on the initial untap effect of Basalt Monolith. Now, once you've net infinite generic mana, you can go ahead and use Initiates of the Ebon Hand 4 or more times, however many you want, an infinite number of times to get infinite black mana. The thing is, at the end of that turn, he will die. However, your opponents will also be dying on the same turn, so I think it's a fair trade. Now, you didn't think I'd just leave you with 3 measly infinite mana combos, did you? There is one of my favorite combos in this list. This is one of the only legendary commanders outside of one of my favorite lists with Tashar that can utilize this combo to great effect. And that is Basalt Monolith and Mesmeric Orb. So I already talked about it in regards to our stacks elements, but Basalt Monolith allows it to untap itself however many times you choose. And as we know, Mesmeric Orb reads, it's symmetrical. Anytime someone untaps a permanent, they have to mill the top card of their library. Well, guess who enjoys a good milling? Sir Conrad. So with Syr Konrad, the Grim out, Basalt Monolith, and Mesmeric Orb, again, this is a setup cost of at least 10 mana. So it's not too hard to get to. You're likely going to have 1 or 2 components out before this ever goes off. So, hopefully Syr Konrad the Grim, and then you can just drop the other 2 for 5. But however you play it out, once you go about tapping Basalt Monolith, you can untap it, get the triggered effect of Mesmeric Orb on the stack, and do that as many times as you choose to get Syr Konrad's ability to go off as many times as you like. And this is going to allow you to damage out the board with your Titan in the graveyard, your Kozilek and or Ulamog, whatever you choose. You just need a shuffler in your list to keep going and hitting a creature, dealing damage to each of your opponents. Now, certainly this deck list is not without faults. You are going to run into troubles by way of artifacts still. Things like Cursed Totem, things like Null Rod are going to shut you down. Those 2 CMC artifact pieces that just hate on a lot of lists, but particularly mono black, because we don't have effective means to get rid of them. The good bit of news, we do have a few things to remove artifacts from our opponents, but things like Null Rod affect the whole board state. So you can likely expect someone else to handle that, and if they don't, you will go about dismantling it yourself with things like Blast Zone and Ratchet Bomb if push comes to shove. But for the most part, this is one of the only mono black lists that I've played that skirts around the issue of grave hate. I really like that about this list. Again, Grafdigger's Cage will still affect you if you're using a creature-based strategy, but if you look at all of our strategies, only one of these effectively uses a creature as the core part of the combo. Initiative of the Ebon Hands, you're generally not going to play until you've established the Rings of Brighthearth Basalt Monolith loop, and then you'll play your Initiate of the Ebon Hand. You're not just going to have Initiates of the Ebon Hand out on the field. If you need to filter black mana, then you will. We all understand triple black is really difficult for Necropotence. You're not always going to have Dark Ritual in your hand, so you can use it for filtering, and it's nice because you can filter up to 4 times. So 3 for that, you're totally fine. It does have value outside of the combo. However, generally speaking, I'd try to reserve him for the combo. So the combos we utilize don't really rely on creatures for the most part. For filtering, yes, Magus of the Coffers, obviously, but 2 of those combos can just strictly go over top of any other strategy should Null Rod not be on the field for those artifact-based ones. So, in my opinion, I think this is one of the stronger mono black lists that we're going to get for a while, just by way of not getting stunted in the mid to long game. Of course, there are faster mono black lists. If you play Sidisi Storm, that's clearly going to operate at breakneck speeds and threaten the board to stop it. Conrad is not one of those lists. It is going to play mid-game, and if you play smart, you will be able to dismantle your opponents and play out your strategy the way you choose and when you choose to. And for that, I really enjoy Sir Conrad the Grim. It is by far and away the most unique mono black commander we've seen in a long time. That triggered ability has 3 angles of attack, all of which are very easy to accomplish in mono black, particularly that first one. Whenever another creature dies, we're just sacrificing stuff for days in most black lists. If you want to go that route, that is something to consider, but I like those 2 other ones most, and you can't sleep on that activated ability. If anyone decides to Sylvan Tutor and they forget that your Sir Conrad's out, go ahead and punish them. And that's the thing, because we're manipulating infinite mana to play this strategy, it's okay if we cast him early to have an attacker, to have a blocker for our planeswalkers, and again, to have that excellent mill strategy on deck. This is a really good card and certainly worthy of your consideration if you're planning to build a mono black commander. But if you are constructing for Syr Konrad the Grim, let me know what your list is. What strategy did you employ? I was trying to shake away from the grave strategies of old because I find they're not as effective in a competitive board. However, whatever you're doing, I'm curious to find out. I really like this guy. I want to see how everyone else is brewing for him. But not only him, I'm planning on doing 2 more deck techs for Throne of Eldraine. One is going to be for a red commander, and the other is for a blue commander. It's very rare that I decide to construct anything for blue, so you have to know that this card is special for at least one reason. Throne of Eldraine gave us a lot of interesting legendaries to work with, and I'm very excited to continue brewing for them. As a matter of fact, the other list already brewed for. I just need to make sure they check out strategy-wise. The red one, a little bit tougher to get to go off than I thought. The blue one, obviously good, but I'm excited to share those 2 lists with you as well. And if you want to discuss any of the featured lists here on the show, you can of course do so in the YouTube comments section, but we also have an Instagram, Twitter, and Discord to discuss recent releases and of course new lists that we brew. Again, my name is Patrick Marlatt, and happy brewing, babies.